John Carter, not the hunky, sword-wielding Martian adventurer you might be thinking of, but a slightly past his prime, comfortably padded gentleman with a penchant for comfortable silence and an unhealthy obsession with maintaining the perfect lawn. John lived a solitary life in the picturesque, read, cookie-cutter, suburban enclave of Pleasantville Estates, USA. Now, on the surface, John appeared to be just another cog in the suburban machine, a successful, albeit slightly eccentric, professional who enjoyed the simple pleasures of a well-aged scotch and the satisfying click of a freshly mowed lawn. What his neighbors didn't know was that John was secretly the benevolent and occasionally mischievous overlord of their little slice of suburban paradise. You see, John, through a tangled web of LLCs so complex they'd make a corporate lawyer weep with envy, owned most of the darn neighborhood. He'd acquired the properties over the years, initially as investments, but slowly developed a morbid fascination with the sheer power it gave him. The ability to control the destiny of perfectly manicured lawns and beige-painted houses? It was intoxicating. He mostly used his power for good, keeping rents reasonable, secretly funding the local school bake sales, that kind of thing. But let's be honest, there was a tiny, mischievous part of him that enjoyed knowing he could, theoretically, paint all the houses neon pink if he felt like it. Enter Karen Reynolds. Karen, my friends, was a specimen. A walking, talking, hairsprayed monument to suburban tyranny. As the self-appointed, democratically unchallenged president of the Pleasantville Estates Homeowners Association, HOA, Karen wielded her power with the iron fist of a tiny, pastel-clad dictator. She was the kind of woman who measured your grass blades with a ruler, sent strongly worded letters about the improper placement of garden gnomes, and probably dreamed of a world where all houses were painted the exact same shade of off-white. Her fashion sense was, shall we say, distinctive. Think floral print paired with aggressively sensible shoes, and enough jewelry to set off metal detectors at the airport. Her voice, a shrill nasal whine, could curdle milk at 50 paces. And her sense of entitlement, off the charts. Karen saw herself as the protector of Pleasantville Estates, the guardian of its pristine aesthetic, the gatekeeper against any deviation from her meticulously crafted vision of suburban perfection. And naturally, John Carter was about to become her biggest problem. The first sign of trouble arrived in the form of an official-looking letter, emblazoned with the Pleasantville Estates HOA logo, a picture of a perfectly symmetrical house surrounded by equally perfect flowers. John chuckled as he slid it open. He knew this was coming. His lawn was looking a bit shaggy lately, and he'd been meaning to get around to repainting the porch trim. He'd just been busy, running his empire of real estate and silently judging his neighbors' questionable landscaping choices. The letter, penned in Karen's distinctive passive-aggressive tone, accused John of a litany of offenses against the HOA bylaws. His grass was too long. His hedges were not uniformly shaped. His garbage cans were visible from the street for a period exceeding the allowable 5 minutes. And, worst of all, his front porch, according to the HOA's color matching system, was approximately 0.00000001 shades off the approved, whispering wheat color. The letter concluded with a dire warning. Failure to comply with these demands within 7 days would result in escalating fines, potential legal action, and the dreaded public shaming at the next HOA meeting. John rolled his eyes. Public shaming? Seriously? Did Karen think this was the Salem witch trials? He briefly considered ignoring the letter. He could, after all, buy the entire HOA and fire her on the spot. But where was the fun in that? No, this called for a more creative approach. A few days later, as John was enjoying a quiet afternoon on his porch, a shadow fell across his meticulously ignored lawn. He looked up to see Karen Reynolds herself, standing there with her hands on her hips and a look of thunderous disapproval on her face. She was accompanied by Mildred, an elderly resident of the community, who was known for gossiping and volunteering on several committees. "Mr. Carter," Karen said, her voice dripping with disdain, "I trust you received our letter?" John, affecting a look of confusion, replied, "Letter? Oh, you mean the one about the grass." "The grass, Mr. Carter," Karen said. emphasizing the word as if it were a particularly offensive swear word, is a disgrace. It's an affront to the entire community. And don't even get me started on those hedges. Well, I've been meaning to get to it, John said, feigning contrition. Things have just been so hectic lately. Karen's eyes narrowed. Hectic? What could possibly be more important than maintaining the aesthetic integrity of Pleasantville Estates? John paused, considering his options. He could reveal his ownership of the neighborhood, instantly disarming her and sending her scurrying back to her pastel-colored lair. But no, that would be too easy, too boring. Instead, he decided to play the part of the hapless homeowner, completely at the mercy of the HOA's whims. "You're right, Ms. Reynolds," he said, his voice filled with false humility. "I'll get right on it. First thing tomorrow morning." Karen seemed satisfied, but her eyes still held a hint of suspicion. "See that you do, Mr. Carter. We have standards to uphold here." She handed him a small, laminated card with the HOA's official color chart. "And make sure you use the right shade of whispering wheat." As Karen waddled back to her SUV, Mildred shot John a sympathetic look and whispered, "Good luck, dear. She's a terror." John smiled wryly. "Thanks, Mildred. I'll need it." As he watched Karen drive away, a slow burn of righteous indignation began to simmer within John. It wasn't just the nitpicking, the arrogance, or the sheer absurdity of the HOA regulations. It was the principle of the thing. The very next morning, John, fueled by a potent cocktail of spite and a triple-shot espresso, launched Operation Dekarenification. His first step? Intel gathering. Forget calling in airstrikes or deploying Navy SEALs. John's arsenal consisted of a highly paid lawyer with a penchant for loopholes, a surprisingly tech-savvy private investigator named Brenda with a fondness for Hawaiian shirts, and an unhealthy amount of free time. He started with a call to his lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, a man whose legal genius was only surpassed by his talent for dry wit and his ability to bill by the nanosecond. "Abernathy here. What legal shenanigans are you plotting today, John?" "Karen Reynolds," John said, cutting to the chase. "HOA president. Wants to make my life miserable because my grass is too long." Abernathy chuckled. "Ah, the HOA. The suburban equivalent of the Spanish Inquisition. Tell me everything." John laid out the situation, painting Karen as a power-hungry tyrant with a penchant for micromanaging perfectly ordinary lives. Abernathy listened patiently, occasionally interjecting with sarcastic remarks and legal strategies that sounded suspiciously like something out of a spy movie. "All right, John," Abernathy said finally. "I'll dig into the HOA's financials. See if our dear Karen has been playing fast and loose with the community's funds. It's surprising how often these petty dictators have their fingers in the cookie jar." Next up was Brenda, the private investigator. Brenda was a walking stereotype, a middle-aged woman with a husky voice, a chain-smoking habit, and an uncanny ability to find dirt on anyone. John had hired her for various, let's just say, sensitive matters in the past, and she had never disappointed. "Brenda, darling," John said, "I need you to dig up everything you can find on Karen Reynolds. I want to know her childhood secrets, her tax returns, her favorite flavor of ice cream, everything." Brenda cackled. "Honey, you've come to the right place. I can find dirt on Mother Teresa if you give me enough time." While Abernathy and Brenda were busy digging up dirt, John decided to do some recon of his own. He attended the next HOA meeting, disguised in a baseball cap and sunglasses, pretending to be a disgruntled resident named Carl. The meeting was a masterclass in suburban absurdity. Karen, perched on her throne like a benevolent despot, droned on about the importance of maintaining uniformity and the dangers of letting weeds grow rampant. The other residents, a collection of stepford wives and henpecked husbands, nodded along in silent agreement, terrified of incurring Karen's wrath. The humor in retribution was not lost on John. John listened intently, taking mental notes of Karen's personality quirks, her allies, and her weaknesses. He learned that she had a deep-seated fear of public embarrassment, a pathological need for control, and an unhealthy obsession with her prize-winning petunias. As luck, or perhaps John's meticulous planning, would have it, Abernathy and Brenda soon struck gold. Abernathy discovered some irregularities in the HOA's financial records, suspicious transfers, unexplained expenses, and a general lack of transparency. It seemed Karen had been using the HOA's funds to finance her extravagant lifestyle, including a lavish vacation to the Bahamas and a suspiciously expensive collection of porcelain cats. Brenda, meanwhile, uncovered something even juicier. It turned out that Karen had a checkered past. Before she was the queen of Pleasantville Estates, she was a ruthless real estate agent who had been accused of fraud and unethical business practices. She had even been sued by a previous HOA for similar offenses. But the real jackpot came in the form of Alan Whitaker, the former HOA treasurer. Alan had been ousted by Karen for questioning her financial dealings. He was bitter, resentful, and more than willing to spill the beans. John met with Alan at a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town. Alan, a nervous, fidgety man with a comb-over and a perpetually worried expression, looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Mr. Carter," Alan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been waiting for someone to expose Karen for what she is. She's a monster." Alan proceeded to unload a mountain of dirt on Karen. He provided John with copies of incriminating documents, emails, and even a recording of Karen admitting to her crimes. It was a goldmine of information, enough to bring Karen down and send her to the suburban equivalent of Siberia, which, let's be honest, is probably just a slightly less desirable HOA. John now had everything he needed to launch the next phase of his plan. He had the evidence, the motivation, and the perfect target. It was time to unleash the hounds of justice, or, at least, the slightly less ferocious dachshunds of revenge. His plan was simple, yet diabolically clever. He would use the information he had gathered to expose Karen's crimes to the community, turning her own power against her. He would reveal her hypocrisy, her greed, and her utter lack of moral character. He would make her a laughingstock, a pariah, the ultimate cautionary tale for aspiring suburban tyrants. But John wasn't just interested in exposing Karen. He wanted to make an example of her. He wanted to show the world that even the most powerful bullies can be brought down, that even the most meticulously constructed facades can crumble under the weight of truth. And he wanted to do it with style, with humor, and with a healthy dose of good old-fashioned revenge. He knew the success of his plan depended on timing and execution. He needed to choose the right moment, the right venue, and the right method to deliver his devastating blow. He decided to leverage the power of the internet, the ultimate weapon against tyranny, both real and suburban. He created a website, tastefully, well, as tastefully as possible given the circumstances, titled Pleasantville Truth, and began uploading the evidence he had gathered. He posted copies of the HOA's financial records, Alan Whitaker's affidavit, Brenda's juicy findings about Karen's past, and even a few choice excerpts from Karen's own emails, highlighting her particularly egregious acts of hypocrisy and pettiness. He made sure the website was easily shareable on social media, and even created a few memes poking fun at Karen's over-the-top personality and her ridiculous HOA regulations. One meme, featuring a picture of Karen dressed in her signature floral print, was captioned "Karen Reynolds, making Pleasantville Estates great again by making everyone's lives miserable." Within hours, Pleasantville Truth went viral. The residents of Pleasantville Estates, who had previously been too afraid to speak out against Karen, suddenly found their voices. They shared the website on Facebook, Twitter, and even gasp, MySpace, expressing their outrage and demanding accountability. The comments sections exploded with stories of Karen's petty tyranny, her unfair enforcement of the rules, and her blatant abuse of power. People shared tales of woe about lawn ornaments being deemed aesthetically displeasing, of mailboxes being an inch too short, and of garbage cans being left out for a mere 6 minutes and 1 second. The backlash was swift and merciless. Karen, who had previously been revered as the queen of Pleasantville Estates, was now being vilified as a power-hungry fraud. Her reputation, painstakingly built over years of meticulous micromanaging, was crumbling before her very eyes. Karen, predictably, did not take this lying down. She launched a counteroffensive, attempting to discredit the website and smear John's reputation. She claimed that the information on Pleasantville Truth was fabricated, that Alan Whitaker was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, and that John Carter was a troublemaker trying to undermine the community. She hired a PR firm to spin the story in her favor, and even went on the local news to defend herself. "These are all lies," Karen wailed on camera, her voice cracking with indignation. "I have dedicated my life to making Pleasantville Estates a better place. I would never do anything to harm this community." However, her desperate attempts at damage control only made things worse. The more she denied the accusations, the more suspicious people became. Her PR firm quickly abandoned her, realizing that she was a lost cause, and her appearance on the local news only served to highlight her shrill, controlling personality, solidifying her image as the villain of the piece. Meanwhile, John was busy playing chess with the legal system. On Abernathy's advice, he had quietly filed a lawsuit against Karen, accusing her of breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and defamation. The lawsuit was a strategic move, designed to put pressure on Karen and force her to resign from the HOA. Karen, in turn, hired her own lawyer, a slick, ambulance-chasing type named Barry, the Barracuda Benson. Barry, known for his aggressive tactics and his uncanny ability to win cases no matter how hopeless, vowed to fight John tooth and nail. The two lawyers engaged in a series of legal skirmishes, filing motions, issuing subpoenas, and generally making each other's lives miserable. The legal battle became a spectator sport in Pleasantville Estates, with residents eagerly following every twist and turn of the case. The turning point came when John's lawyer subpoenaed the HOA's financial records. Karen, realizing that the game was up, panicked. She knew that the records would expose her crimes beyond any doubt. In a desperate attempt to cover her tracks, she tried to destroy the evidence. She shredded documents, deleted emails, and even attempted to bribe the HOA's accountant to falsify the records. But her efforts were in vain. The accountant, a morally upright woman named Doris, refused to cooperate and instead turned Karen in to the authorities. The authorities promptly raided Karen's house, seizing her computers, her financial records, and her extensive collection of porcelain cats, which, ironically, were probably purchased with stolen HOA funds. With Karen's crimes now fully exposed, the residents of Pleasantville Estates demanded her resignation. They organized a protest outside her house, carrying signs that read, "Resign now, Karen," and "No more HOA tyranny." The pressure was too much for Karen to bear. Faced with the prospect of criminal charges, public humiliation, and the loss of her precious power, she finally caved. She issued a brief statement, announcing her resignation from the HOA and apologizing, sort of, for her actions. "It is with a heavy heart that I announce my resignation as president of the Pleasantville Estates Homeowners Association," she wrote. "I have always acted in the best interests of the community, but I understand that my methods may have been perceived as overly assertive. I wish the HOA all the best in the future." And with that, Karen Reynolds, the Queen of Pleasantville Estates, was dethroned. Her reign of terror was over, and the community could finally breathe a collective sigh of relief. But the story wasn't over yet. John still had a few more tricks up his sleeve, and he was determined to make Karen pay for her crimes. The sweet nectar of revenge was about to be tasted. Just when Karen thought things couldn't possibly get worse, John decided to crank up the heat. He wasn't content with simply dethroning her. He wanted to ensure that she faced the full consequences of her actions. He was out for blood, or at least a hefty fine and a lifetime ban from ever serving on an HOA again. Remember Claudia Harris, Karen's former assistant? The one who was practically invisible, the quiet, unassuming woman who fetched Karen's lattes and organized her color-coded files? Well, Claudia was about to become John's secret weapon. Claudia, it turned out, had been silently witnessing Karen's misdeeds for years. She had seen Karen manipulate the financial records, bully the residents, and generally act like a suburban Marie Antoinette. She had always been too afraid to speak out, fearing Karen's wrath. But now, with Karen's empire crumbling, Claudia finally found the courage to come forward. She contacted John through an anonymous email, offering to provide him with even more incriminating evidence. John, of course, was delighted. He arranged a clandestine meeting with Claudia at a neutral location, a deserted donut shop on the outskirts of town. Claudia, looking nervous and relieved at the same time, handed John a USB drive filled with damning information. The drive contained emails, documents, and even video recordings that exposed the full extent of Karen's crimes. One email, in particular, was a real doozy. It was a message from Karen to a local contractor, instructing him to inflate the price of a landscaping project and then kick back a portion of the profits to her personal bank account. Another document revealed that Karen had been using the HOA's funds to pay for her daughter's lavish wedding, complete with ice sculptures and a live performance by a washed-up 80s pop star. But the most shocking revelation came in the form of a video recording. The video showed Karen berating Claudia for a minor mistake, calling her names and threatening to fire her. It was a truly appalling display of cruelty and abuse of power. With this new evidence in hand, John was ready to deliver the knockout blow. John didn't just want to prove that Karen had committed crimes. He wanted to show that she had a pattern of committing crimes. He wanted to demonstrate that she was a serial HOA abuser, a menace to suburban communities everywhere. Brenda, the private investigator, had already uncovered some information about Karen's past. She had learned that Karen had been involved in similar scandals at previous HOAs. But John wanted to dig even deeper. He hired Brenda to track down the victims of Karen's past misdeeds. He wanted to hear their stories, to document their experiences, to create a compelling narrative that would expose Karen as a repeat offender. Brenda, with her usual blend of tenacity and charm, managed to track down several former residents who had been victimized by Karen. They told stories of unfair fines, arbitrary rules, and relentless harassment. They described how Karen had made their lives miserable, driving them to the brink of despair. One former resident, a sweet old lady named Agnes, tearfully recounted how Karen had forced her to remove her beloved bird feeder because it was not in keeping with the aesthetic of the community. Another resident, a young couple with a newborn baby, described how Karen had repeatedly complained about the noise their baby made, even though they were well within the HOA's noise limits. These stories, combined with the new evidence from Claudia, painted a damning picture of Karen as a manipulative, power-hungry bully who had made a career out of tormenting ordinary people. John, armed with this mountain of evidence, contacted the local authorities and demanded that they reopen the investigation into Karen's crimes. He presented them with the emails, the documents, the video recordings, and the testimonies from Karen's former victims. The authorities, initially hesitant to get involved in what they saw as a petty HOA dispute, were now forced to take the matter seriously. The evidence was overwhelming, and the public outcry was deafening. They launched a full-scale investigation into Karen's activities, interviewing witnesses, subpoenaing documents, and generally making her life a living hell. Karen, realizing that the walls were closing in, became increasingly desperate. She tried to intimidate Claudia into recanting her testimony, but Claudia refused to be bullied. She even tried to bribe the authorities to drop the charges, but her attempts were unsuccessful. The noose was tightening around Karen's neck, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before she faced the consequences of her actions. The sweet taste of revenge was practically palpable. All John had to do was watch the house of cards collapse. He could already hear the satisfying thud. Just when John thought he'd uncovered every last one of Karen's dastardly deeds, he stumbled upon one final, truly egregious act of betrayal. It turned out that Karen, in a last-ditch effort to salvage her failing empire, had secretly negotiated a deal to sell a valuable piece of community land to a real estate developer. The land in question was a small park, the only green space in Pleasantville Estates. It was a place where children played, families picnicked, and dogs chased frisbees. It was the heart and soul of the community. Karen, without consulting the other residents, had agreed to sell the park to a developer who planned to build a strip mall on the site. She had secretly pocketed a hefty commission from the deal, lining her own pockets at the expense of the community she was supposed to serve. This was the final straw. Even Karen's most loyal supporters were outraged. They felt betrayed, used, and utterly disgusted by her greed. John, of course, was livid. Not only was Karen trying to destroy the community he secretly controlled, but she was doing it in such a brazen and underhanded way. He knew he had to stop her no matter the cost. John, using his vast network of contacts and resources, quickly uncovered the details of Karen's secret deal. He contacted the city council, the local media, and a team of environmental lawyers. He exposed Karen's plan to the public, revealing her greed, her dishonesty, and her utter disregard for the community. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. The city council, facing intense pressure from the residents of Pleasantville Estates, voted unanimously to block the sale of the park land. The real estate developer, realizing that the deal was dead, backed out of the agreement. Karen's plan to destroy the heart of Pleasantville Estates had been thwarted. With her crimes now fully exposed and her reputation in tatters, Karen finally faced the music. The authorities, armed with John's evidence and the testimonies of numerous witnesses, arrested her on multiple charges, including fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. She was hauled away in handcuffs, her floral print dress rumpled and her hair a mess. As she was led away, she glared at John with pure, unadulterated hatred in her eyes. "You haven't won, Carter," she shrieked. "I'll get you for this. You'll regret the day you ever crossed me." John simply smiled and waved goodbye. He knew that Karen's threats were empty. Her power was gone, her reputation was ruined, and her freedom was about to be taken away. With Karen behind bars, the residents of Pleasantville Estates could finally begin to heal. They held a community meeting to discuss the future of the HOA and to elect new leaders. John, still operating under his guise of a mild-mannered homeowner, quietly nominated Alan Whitaker, the former treasurer, to be the new president of the HOA. Alan, grateful for John's support, vowed to run the HOA with fairness, transparency, and a commitment to serving the community. The residents of Pleasantville Estates, inspired by John's courage and his unwavering commitment to justice, elected Alan by a landslide. Under Alan's leadership, the HOA was completely reformed. The rules were simplified, the fees were lowered, and the atmosphere of fear and intimidation was replaced with a sense of community and cooperation. And what about John? Did he reveal his secret ownership of the neighborhood? Did he bask in the glory of his triumph over Karen? No, he didn't. He simply faded back into the background, content to watch the community thrive under its new leadership. He continued to live his quiet, solitary life, occasionally mowing his lawn or hiring someone else to do it, and enjoying a glass of scotch on his front porch. He knew that he had done the right thing, that he had stood up for justice and protected the community he secretly loved. And that was reward enough. Of course, he did allow himself one final, small act of revenge. He purchased Karen's house through one of his many LLCs, naturally, and turned it into a community center, a place where residents could gather, socialize, and learn about the importance of fighting for their rights. He even had a plaque installed on the front of the house, dedicated to the victims of HOA tyranny. The plaque read, "In memory of all those who have suffered under the rule of petty dictators. May their stories inspire us to stand up for what is right." And so, the tale of John Carter and the HOA from hell came to a satisfying conclusion. Karen Reynolds, the queen of Pleasantville Estates, had been dethroned, exposed, and brought to justice. And John Carter, the quiet, unassuming homeowner, had emerged as the unlikely hero of the story. The moral of the story? Don't mess with a man who owns the entire neighborhood, especially if he has a healthy sense of humor and a taste for sweet, sweet revenge. And always be nice to your neighbors. You never know when one of them might secretly be your landlord.